So the American poet Kaveh Akbar has a line from one of his poems in which he says, feels like it's January in both directions. And I wanted to make a video in which I recommend some books from my collection that will help you get through this kind of bleak time of the year. It's Christmas and New Year passed us by like a cruise ship, all lit up and glowingly disappearing over the dark horizon. And all we've got is storm and sleet and grime and darkness. That sounds heavy, so let's bring a little light to chase the cobwebs away, to vanquish the shadows, and get us through to spring. Now, some of you are probably in the Southern Hemisphere. I grew up in the Southern Hemisphere, so I know that you're probably just luxuriating on a beach right now, eating a hot dog, and, well, damn you, because here in the Northern Hemisphere, we are embattled, soaked, damp, benighted, and crouching under the epitaph of rat-colored clouds. I pulled down a whole bunch of vintage classics. I know you guys love this imprint. I do too. Good quality in terms of the printing, and often have great introductions and are aesthetically pleasing. So I pulled down a bunch of vintage classics from my shelves and picked out 10 that I think can help us get through these dark months. So first I've got Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. In this gorgeous vintage classics line, they did pretty much all of her books in this beautiful kind of collector's edition series, and have had various other Virginia Woolf books in this vintage classics series, but this was the only one that I could find on my shelves at present, although I have all of her books in various editions in my library. To the Lighthouse. If I had a gun to my head and I had to choose a favorite book of all time, which is a horrible question for us book lovers, you can't narrow it down. I could probably narrow down my favorite books to around top 50, but if I really was forced to choose, this would be a good contender for my favorite book of all time. It's magnificent. It's kind of a retelling of the Odyssey in modern terms, with this fragmented, alienated, anxiety-ridden consciousness. We have the figure of Mrs. Ramsay, who has this parallel with Penelope from Homer's Odyssey, but she's this modern, bright and capable woman who runs her household, who loves her children, who supports her husband, who's irascible and grouchy and tumbling through this kind of alphabet of biographical idealism, in the sense that he is a surrogate for Woolf's own father, who was Leslie Stephen, a famous critic in his own day and biographer. And so you have these classical parallels with the ironic distance between the shield-wielding bravado of the Odyssey and this modern, domestic, private, microcosmic retelling of that epic adventure and discovery and Odyssey, setting forth in order to find one's home or re-find one's home, or to find oneself, define one's identity. So it's fragmented, it's full of jump cuts and interwoven consciousness of various characters, which makes it challenging in the best kind of sense of challenging. It peels back our levels of comfort and engenders a sense of empathetic seeking of another's mind and thoughts in a very limpid but lyrical way. And also the middle chapter of this book is one of the most gorgeously musical and mournful elegies of a certain family home, a space, a beloved site of bricks and mortar filled to the gills with memories and the regret of lost loved ones. It's the most stunning evocation of love and sorrow of family. And as I mentioned, Mr. Ramsay being the surrogate for Woolf's father. In fact, the whole story really is her love letter to her family. Mrs. Ramsay is the fictionalized figuration of her own mother, and in fact, Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell, the painter Vanessa Bell, when To the Lighthouse was published in 1927, Vanessa Bell wrote a letter to Virginia saying, "You have given me a vivid aesthetic representation of my heart, of our beloved mother who we lost so young, and of other members of the family." And I think that was the highest praise that Virginia Woolf could ever have asked for. And absolutely stunning book. I've read it more than once. I plan to read it many, many more times and can't recommend it highly enough. So we're off to a good start here. Let this book get you through the bleakness of January. Next, I've got Ernest Hemingway, Fiesta, The Sun Also Rises. Talked about Woolf, talked about Hemingway quite a lot on this channel, and they're both sons in my literary constellation, in my personal canon. Now, Fiesta is, in many people's reckoning, Hemingway's best book. I thought it was very impressive, very fluid and seamless writing about parties and intoxication and sexual frustration and the kind of unmanned insecurities of a character wounded in war, as Hemingway himself was wounded in war in a very sensitive area, just put it that way. The story revolves around this famous bullfight in Spain, and yeah, not being a fan of bullfighting definitely leaves a slightly bitter taste for myself having read this, but there is a nimbleness and a lightness to the story. You feel like you're a part of this crew of party animals, basically slushing and sloshing their way through the burning summer in Spain, and it feels like you're on a road trip with old friends. It's definitely a very sun-drenched and blood-soaked book, but certainly something to get your synapses sparkling and to help you get through the winter months. Okay, now as I usually do, I've waffled quite significantly in the first two books. I'm going to try and pick up the pace here. I have got 3 books by Toni Morrison. Now, Toni Morrison is also a key writer in my personal canon. I've got 3 Toni Morrisons here in the vintage. I've got the Red Spine edition of Beloved. Now, a lot of people say Song of Solomon is Morrison's best novel. I found Song of Solomon to be quite underwhelming, but Beloved is just an absolute explosion of historical and psychic pain and feeling, and the connection between parents and children, and a sense of gaping, irreparable loss, and how our imaginations, how our subconscious deals with those ghastly and disfiguring losses. She was a single mother in New York in the 1970s and 80s, raising 2 sons, working a full-time job in publishing and writing novels is why she's one of my heroes. But knowing Morrison's ethos and her artistic sensibility and her ambitions and the incredible pinnacle that she reached in her career. Now, I shouldn't have to mention this, but unfortunately I do. But just because she deals with race and slavery, and unfortunately some commentators have taken that as an excuse to do lazy analysis and focusing their evaluation of her work purely around the theme of race. And she was an artist in the highest degree, and it would be a massive disservice to her work to limit one's exegesis purely to the socio-political realm of race, because she was an artist on the highest level, and Beloved is in my opinion, her best novel. It's so invigorating, it's horrifying, but it's so filled with bravery and determination and spookiness as well, magic realism at its very best. And definitely, if you want help getting out of bed, if you want help to face your challenges, then this book will do that for you. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Then I've got, like I said, 3 Toni Morrisons in the vintage. I've got A Mercy. This is one of her lesser novels, but still a fantastic, enjoyable, and stimulating experience to read A Mercy. I've read this book twice, and it's certainly a repaid rereading. And it's a book, I think, that is in touch with the entanglement of colonization and the environment, of the subjugation of peoples, but also of the land, also of this fertile American greenery that is, brought under the whip and ox cart of the American settlers. And it's an interesting mix of characters from different backgrounds and the complications and divergences of their experiences, their communications and miscommunications, and the ravages of living in a far-flung place hundreds of years ago, before civilization and capitalism had spread all around the world, and whatever the color of your skin, you were susceptible to disease and pestilence and attacks by bandits and criminals. And it was just really a wild and brutal time to be alive in America and elsewhere in the world. And I think that historical element is very well researched and very well executed in A Mercy. Then we've got Home. Again, another one of Toni Morrison's less talked about works. This is the story of Frank Money. Toni Morrison, a bit like Charles Dickens, who we're going to look at in a moment, was so good at naming characters. So Frank Money, he's a war veteran who comes back from Korea to the States and faces just all kinds of frustrations and discriminations and blood-boilingly annoying circumstances, and he is a misfit. He can't quite find his place, and it's very poetically written. It is a story of displacement and the search for home, and sometimes when you're in the bleak spectral depths of January, you want that companionship of a book about the search for home. So here we go. Okay, next I've got Norwegian Wood by Murakami. I love the design of this book. It's got a real retro flair to it, and this is probably Murakami's most famous book, and interestingly, one of his few novels without magic realism. Now, this book has that brevity of prose that is so characteristic of Murakami, but yet belies emotional and philosophical depth. It is cozy and full of yearning, and it's a great winter read, I think. You feel like you are ambling along the streets of Tokyo on a wet night with all of the bars and restaurants lighting the wet asphalt, and it's very atmospheric, and that's what was so enjoyable about it. I actually wanted to include another Murakami here, which is South of the Border, West of the Sun, a lesser-known Murakami novel that I highly recommend. It's so suffused with intimacy and mystery and this uncanny desire to know another that is always thwarted. Next, I've got Despair by Vladimir Nabokov. Less known of his works, but in this nice vintage edition. And sometimes when you're crawling through the long winter months, you don't always want a light, fun, breezy book. Sometimes you want a fellow struggler to go shoulder to shoulder with you through the mud and the mire. And this book is certainly not light. It's certainly not fun. It is a sort of irreverent, inside-out murder story, but with a lot of existential musing. It's pretty bleak. It's pretty barren of color, but sometimes that sense of despair is actually a comfort in dark times. So maybe this is what you're looking for to get you through the winter. Then I've got Raymond Carver, Cathedral. I've talked about Carver in my other Vintage Classics video. I will leave a link to that video as well. And this is Carver doing what he does best. Fantastic short stories, really so enigmatic in the sense that you start off in some roadside diner with some frazzled divorcee, and you end up in some sunflower-filled field in West Milwaukee, and you don't know quite how you got there, but you don't really know what the plot and the story insinuated, but there is this lingering effect, this residue of reality that is so tangible but ineffable, and that's really what a good short story does, in my opinion. And that Carver is amazing, and there's an interesting intertextuality to Cathedral that I don't hear people talk about all that much. And the intertextuality is used for an interesting juxtaposition, an ironic juxtaposition. So he mentions, for example, Jack London in one of these stories, which is set in a rehab center. And Jack London is this figure of adventure, right? This writer, the writer of The Call of the Wild and White Fang. And this juxtaposition between Jack London's kind of romantic and melodramatic life and the sort of flat, despairing hopelessness of these worn-out characters. That contrast is so interesting. Or another story mentions the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Again, this fabulousness of a fairy tale with its predictable, comfy narrative cycle, in comparison with this meandering, listless, aimless American dropout kind of atmosphere, and that contrast is so illuminating. But if you want looking for short stories to dip in and out of, this book will certainly probably highlight your own problems, and when you compare them to some of the problems of these characters, maybe you'll feel a bit better. But I certainly enjoy Carver any time of year. I've got 3 left. I've got John William Stoner. Now, a lot of people adore this book. I'm going to be honest and say that I think it's a little bit overrated, but it still has some very tender moments, very poignant, and it's got a very touching ending, which I won't spoil for those of you that haven't read this. I just thought I'd include it because, again, it's one of those books that maybe kindles your own determination to continue and to chase your dreams, as disparaging as sometimes they might seem, or as determined people around you might be to level you and dispirit you. This is a story of someone who was driven by non-material, non-financial dreams and carved out a journey and a life for himself, which was true to his aims and his desires, and there's something commendable in that. And then the last 2, now this is probably sacrilegious to be talking about A Christmas Carol when it's like weeks after Christmas, but you know what? I'm a rebel. I don't care. You can read Dickens' Christmas writings any time of year, and there's just something warm and comforting and consoling about Dickens in general and about his Christmas writings. Now, this is a nice addition I wanted to show you because it also includes The Chimes and The Haunted Man. So not only A Christmas Carol, and Dickens actually wrote a handful, about at least 4 or 5 Christmas novellas, and Haunted Man and The Chimes are lesser known, but so cozy, like being in slippers, in a dressing gown with a mug of hot cocoa next to a nice blazing fire on a snowy night. And that's the feeling that Dickens gives you any time of year. So don't be dismayed that I'm recommending a Christmas book weeks after Christmas. Don't listen to the haters. You can read Dickens any time of year. You can read his Christmas novellas any time of year, and if you're feeling like you need to hold your hands in front of a blazing conflagration of homely warmth, then go for this. And then finally, to end off, I've got something very different. I've got a history book here, published by Vintage as well, by the writer Russell Shorto. And this is a history of the city of Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is like, if the hobbits had a city, that would be Amsterdam, especially the Negenstraten, the 9 streets, the rings of the inner center of Amsterdam is so lit up by lanterns and candles and the lights shimmering on the dark canals and the smell of pancakes and waffles and other smells too, for those with a taste for things more herbal. That's not me personally. But this is a story of Amsterdam and how the city has always been very liberal and radically open to people from all walks of life, going right back to the Middle Ages. And it's so playfully written and personable and just a nice companion in these dark winter months. So do check it out. It's definitely something if you're interested in the history of the Netherlands and of Amsterdam. Those were my 10 vintage classics to get you through those moments when it feels like it's January in both directions, as the poet Kaveh Akbar said. Thanks so much for watching. What are your cozy winter reads to get you through these dark months? Do please share down below in the comments. I always love to hear from you and interact with you guys. So thank you very much, and until next time.